On a snowy day back in 1995, 3 college students from Tennessee begged their professor to tag along on a cave mapping expedition in Saltpeter Cave. They were novice cavers, but he agreed. Ignoring the warnings, they ventured into the cave on their own a day before they were supposed to. Together, they faced unimaginable horrors and gruesome injuries. Nearly 20 years later, the survivors and rescuers met for a reunion, and the rescuers couldn't believe the shocking tale the cavers told them. Just like them, you're about to relive it all. This is the grisly story of the Saltpeter Cave rescue.
Before we dive into the video, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to this channel. Our subscriber rate has grown from 8% to 13%, which is truly amazing. If you're new here, simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Now let's get into the video.
Dr. Kurt Wise was teaching at a university in Tennessee. He was planning an expedition to Saltpeter Cave, where he would map uncharted passages of the cave's winding tunnels. He needed some backup for safety, and 3 of his students jumped at the chance. Nate Lorenzo and Matt Gore grew up together in Florida, and they both vowed to remain friends even after high school, when so many friendships typically fall apart. They both got accepted into the same college in Tennessee and enrolled in a class taught by Dr. Wise. There, they met the 3rd student joining them for this story, Jake Minton. Saltpeter Cave was once a very challenging cave, with just enough interesting formations to attract cavers from all around the US. The entrance area was expansive and easy to traverse, so teens would often go to the cave for parties, which turned it into the most vandalized cave in the state of Tennessee. Following the shocking events of this story, and many others like it, Saltpeter was closed to the public. Dr. Wise had planned for a Saturday venture into Saltpeter Cave, but on the day before the expedition, the 3 young men had different plans. They wanted to travel through part of the cave on their own ahead of time. Wise immediately knew this was a terrible idea and begged them not to go. He explained that mapping expeditions are not like regular cave outings. Saturday's trip would be very difficult, and the portion they wanted to explore was also tough. They could easily fail that section on their own, or run out of steam midway through Saturday's exploration. Wise tried to reason with them. Why risk their lives? If they wanted a career in caving, and a degree to help them along that path, then they should play it smart, because none of that matters to a pile of bones. Matt, Nate, and Jake were too impatient. Wise eventually realized he couldn't persuade them. They were adults, and they were going to do what they wanted, even if it put them in extreme danger. He gave them some advice and told them to take some vital life-saving supplies, chafing fuel or canned heat, thermo blankets, and more light sources. This advice would be one of the most important parts of their journey, fighting to survive Saltpeter Cave. They were all in good spirits walking into Saltpeter Cave. They made it to the cave's first feature, the prayer room. A strange coincidence, since Jake was a devout believer in God. But then they started to notice something was off. Nate's headlamp started to flicker. Then Jake's. They took off the straps and whacked the side of the light, like people do with remotes out of habit. Sometimes the batteries dislodge, so the technique can actually work. But even if that was the problem, this wasn't a small inconvenience. If their lamps were malfunctioning during a difficult climb or descent, they could easily slip. Or worse. They pressed on, ignoring their second warning. But the flickering of the lights got worse, and soon one of their lights went out. Moisture from the cave could have been seeping into the light's electronics, or maybe they weren't constructed properly. That's yet another warning. They shouldn't have bought cheap knockoffs for things their lives depended on. You wouldn't want a discount airbag in your car, or a thrift store parachute, so why skimp on your only way to see deep below ground? One by one, each of their lights started turning off. They paused, considering what to do. At this point, they were already in a disaster, but they didn't realize the gravity of their situation. Instead of turning around, they kept crawling along in the darkness, bumping into rock forms, and gingerly putting their hands in front of them to avoid going face first into a wall. Even though they didn't turn around, walking in pitch-black darkness did make them quake with terror. It was also slowing them down considerably. Time is a factor many novice cavers don't think about too much. It's hard to know how long a task will take if you've never done it before, and relying on experiences from past beginner caves isn't a great idea either. They didn't know just how bad time can really be when you're stuck in a claustrophobic nightmare. Their lights stayed off for random intervals up to 15 minutes. before they would hauntingly flicker back to life, taunting Matt, Nate, and Jake as they kept pushing their luck. If this group of Tennessee college students kept exploring the cave despite their gear failing, well, the cave must have been a cakewalk, right? Far from it. Saltpeter Cave was pushing them to their limits, physically and mentally. Eventually, they trudged into the waterfall room, a close-quarters tube of rock with a small cliff looking out over the waterfall, and the rest of the room that extended down to a small stretch of dry floor with other passages reaching into the unknown darkness. They paused and looked at the water's ghostly glow in their lights, marveling at the beauty of the cave they had all but overcome on their own. Disaster and miracles in the waterfall room. Matt nodded, standing triumphantly on the cliff, and wiped sweat and mud from his brow. It had all been worth it. That's when they heard sounds. The quick snap of stone, the tumble of rock against rock, and the dusty rush of dirt kicking into the air. Matt had no time to react. The shelf he was standing on was breaking apart. His solid footing and his body suddenly vanished as dust and rubble engulfed him. The cliff looked very far down, too far down. The ledge Matt was standing on was 60 feet tall, over 5.5 stories. It was like Matt had just fallen from the equivalent of a small apartment complex with no awnings, no branches, no bushes, not even the completely soft dirt to catch his fall. Just dense, impenetrable stone. Jake and Nate looked down in horror. As the dust started to settle, they pointed their flickering lights around the room and saw blood sprayed across the walls of the cave. Jake turned around in shock, not wanting to see the damage shrouded by the dust. Nate called down, asking if Matt was all right. No response. Matt looked like a goner. The sight was worse than they could have imagined. Matt's head had bounced off the cave floor, creating a compound fracture in his skull. His hair had torn away, revealing part of his skull beneath a stream of blood. Standing there in pure shock and silence so total and complete, it was like hearing death itself whispering in their ears. Nate and Jake heard a groan, then hoarse breathing. The pair rushed down to Matt. They didn't even think about the structural integrity of the rest of the rock. They had to get to their friend. They got to him and saw his eyes were open, but he was looking past them and moaning in pain. His eyes were black from so many blood vessels that had burst upon impact. His face was also torn up, and his jaw was slack and slanted, broken. His legs were also misshapen, and his lungs sounded like they were punctured. They reached out to cradle him, but they weren't sure if they should move him. As a rule of thumb, cavers and trauma responders are taught not to move a patient until they have stabilizing gear ready, like a stretcher, splints, neck braces, and straps to prevent any injuries from getting worse. One wrong move could cause frayed nerves in Matt's spine to sever, paralyzing him or instantly killing him. Or they could accidentally cause the exposed bone of his skull to sink down and pierce his brain. The trio made their next costly mistake in a string of poor decisions. They stayed there with him, trying to comfort him and reassure him that he would shake it off and climb out. They were in total shock and disbelief about the grim reality playing out before their very eyes. Their voice shook as they talked to him, but Matt was teetering in and out of consciousness. At any moment, he could fall into an irreversible coma or leave this world behind forever. That's when Nate and Jake finally wised up. Nate handed Jake all the lights he had left. He was going to stay behind with his lifelong friend and support him as best as he could. The coldness of the cave was also an issue now. The waterfall room's flowing foam and mist filled the air with cold moisture that began to pool on Matt's exposed flesh and bone. Cavers aren't meant to linger in this room for long, and movement is needed to keep the body warm. The thin candle of Matt's life was burning at both ends as his injuries and the elements threatened to snuff his lights out. To help combat these dangers, Jake gave them the thermal blanket. The only thermal blanket. Despite all of the warnings from the aptly named Dr. Wise, the group only brought one thermal blanket. But, miraculously, it seemed like it was enough. Nate popped open the canned heat and sat them on the bloody ground next to Matt before shaking out the blanket and draping it over him, carefully making sure heat didn't escape from one side. Then, Jake got as close to Matt as he could without risking injury, and pressed the blanket around himself to seal in the warmth and keep them both safe from the cold. For now, Nate rolled around and propped himself up on his elbows to light 2 tea lights, small disc candles in little tins to keep them lit. He lit one for each of them. That way, hopefully, the void wouldn't swallow them up again if a single candle burned out. The fragile light was nearly drenched when Matt started puking in the thermal blanket. In spite of all the incomprehensible nightmares they were faced with, Nate had faith in a higher power, and he felt certain they would all make it out alive. He stayed by his friend's side through it all. He couldn't leave the blanket, or he'd risk his own life, and he was the only one who could help Matt right now. Meanwhile, Jake wasn't feeling as confident. He was panicking as he rushed through the challenging cave, and he kept getting lost. After he spent an uncomfortable length of time navigating the cave alone with messed up lights while Matt's life hung in the balance, Jake finally stumbled out of the mouth of Saltpeter Cave. Now, this was the time before cell phones were necessities of life. Jake had to run to the nearest house, but he got there, started frantically pounding on the door looking like an insane person, blurted out the situation, and called for an emergency rescue. The Cumberland County Rescue Squad and the nearby town's fire department rushed to the cave. An ambulance was standing by, ready to burn rubber at a moment's notice. Luckily for the three eager cavers, this fire department had trained in cave rescue operations, so their first response rescue team was better equipped than most emergency personnel. Cave rescue teams from all around Tennessee, and even some from nearby states, were all on their way as well. Unlike some rescues, the teams were quickly able to traverse the cave. They had studied it well and practiced there. No obstacles stood in their way. Matt's vision darkened as the cold began to numb his already battered limbs. Nate closed his eyes to pray, and in that very moment, the light of the rescue team beamed across the ceiling of the waterfall room. Rescuers quickly got to work to prepare Matt for his grueling trip out of Saltpeter Cave. One rescuer was tasked with carrying a cable that allowed the rescue cavers to talk to the medics outside the cave. There, standing by, was the lead doctor of the ER of the town's hospital, and he was able to guide the fire and caving crews to give Matt the best chance for survival. Even though the rescuers got to Matt in record time, this wasn't a simple in-and-out rescue. Matt was hanging on by a thread. Everything had to be perfect. Outside, a blizzard started covering the outdoor half of the rescue team, which made things even more complicated. Below zero wind chill could be the final straw for Matt. Rescuers started hammering and drilling anchors into the cave walls to create a pulley to lift Matt out of the waterfall room. Other rescuers brought food, supplies, and warm water into the cave for support. They hoisted Matt slowly and carefully up the side of the broken cliff. The parts of the trip that had challenged them would be extra difficult now. Rescuers had to crawl on their hands and knees, precariously balancing Matt on a stretcher fixed on top of their backs to keep him level. Despite the storm, a helicopter was positioned right outside Saltpeter Cave. Matt's consciousness came to one more time as the snow swirled around him as medics raced to get him to the waiting chopper. Over 12 hours after he fell, Matt was airlifted to the trauma wing of a nearby hospital. In the hours and days after the accident, his condition stabilized. Matt was finally saved, but his recovery was just beginning. In the months and years to come, he had to learn how to walk again, and he needed reconstructive surgery to repair the delicate cartilage and features of his face that had been warped and pulverized by the terrible impact on Saltpeter's floor. The reunion and facing demons. Back in 2012, some of the people from this story met up for a reunion. This was the first time the rescuers and the cavers had really met. There wasn't much small talk when Matt was howling for his life, while the others were panicked and the rescuers were in action mode. 12 people showed up from the hundreds that helped save Matt's life. Many of the rescuers had never even heard Matt's story before this reunion. If they even checked the news, they only got snippets. And the news didn't contact them for their side either. They just did their part that day and kept on living life until the next rescue got them out of bed and back into another cave. Their reunion highlighted how it's not just the rescue that changes lives. Sometimes talking about events with the people involved is just as powerful. After all, the rescuers are experts. They do things that normal people could never do. And likewise, newbie cavers do things that experts might not even consider. Getting to know who they're rescuing, what drives them, how they feel, what decisions they make, can all help rescuers save lives in the future. On a personal level, it was probably refreshing for both sides. Rescuers are taught not to get too attached to the cavers they're trying to save. It's not always a lesson explicitly stated in manuals, but it's a lesson they'll be confronted with almost immediately after they sign up for a rescue mission. Rescuers can try their hardest, but at the end of the day, even if they do everything right, life can still slip away. They care deeply. That's why they do it. But if they blame themselves for every life they couldn't save, that guilt would eat them up inside. Many would end up quitting. Some might turn to alcohol and spiral into self-destruction. Some might be haunted for the rest of their lives about the people they saw slip away right before their eyes. But after it's all said and done, meeting the cavers they saved can help remind them that this is what it's all about. Helping people enjoy the world of caving. Giving people a second chance to tell their own stories over their own lives. Of course, it couldn't end there. Matt didn't just recount his experience, he had a new story to tell. After hearing the horrifying extent of Matt's injuries, the rescuers at the reunion sat with mouths open in shock, some with smirks and disbelief when Matt told them that he, Nate, and Jake had all returned to Saltpeter Cave only 3 months after the ordeal, while Matt's brain was still healing. Matt wanted to face his demons and get closure. He could only make it to the first room of the cave before his nerves got the better of him. But 2 years later, Matt and his new fiancée met up with Nate and went into the breach one last time. Matt made it to the waterfall room. And this time, the new trio all made it out, with the sun shining on them and their heads held high in victory. Now, these three might have made a ton of rookie mistakes, but their determination is simply amazing. How would you respond after hearing Matt went back to Saltpeter after all he had been through? Let us know in the comments section. Click the like button if this story inspired you, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible cave rescue stories.